If you enjoy spending your evenings with quiet history, you're welcome to join us. If this brings you something gentle and useful tonight, consider liking the video or subscribing, but only if it truly helps you rest and think. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you now. If you can, put your phone face down, set the volume low, and let the room settle. For the next hour, we'll move at a slow, even pace. The story is large, but we'll take it step by step. Outside your window, imagine a quiet city. The air carries salt, the faint sound of water, maybe a ship's horn in the distance. Now picture the same sound 500 years ago. The same sea, the same breeze, brushing against marble courtyards and the high walls of Topkapi Palace. In the early light, the stones are pale and cool. The city breathes below them, already ancient even then. Istanbul, or Constantinople as the world once called it, was a city that had outlived empires. Its domes had seen Rome, Byzantium, and now the Ottomans. Every ruler who walked its courtyards could feel that weight, the invisible pressure of all who came before. The call to prayer drifted over the water, and somewhere behind the lattice of a window, a new sultan was listening. Tonight, we're entering that world, the world of Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from the chill of the Danube to the deserts of Mesopotamia. His story isn't one of noise and spectacle. It's a story of order, patience, and the long, deliberate movement of power. So take a breath, let the centuries open like a slow gate, and let's begin. Suleiman was 26 when his father, Selim, died. The message reached him quietly. One ruler's breath stops, another begins. That is how empires survive their own weight. When he rode toward the capital to take the throne, the empire he was inheriting was already vast, older than any one man could fully know. The Ottomans had started as a frontier tribe in the early 1300s on the edge between Asia and Europe, where mountains gave way to plains, and the old Byzantine borders still flickered. Generation by generation, they gathered the broken pieces of what lay around them, villages, ports, provinces, until the map no longer looked like an accident, but like a design. By the time Suleiman was born, his ancestors had carried their banners across Anatolia and deep into the Balkans. They had outlived crusades, rival sultanates, and plagues. They had learned how to govern not only soldiers, but merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. Selim, his father, had ruled for only 8 years, but they were sharp years. He pushed the borders south into Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Caravans carrying grain and gold now bowed to the same authority that commanded fleets on the Adriatic. He was feared and respected, and perhaps not loved. When his reign ended, the empire he left behind was larger than it had ever been, an instrument finely tuned and ready to be played by steadier hands. Those hands would be his sons. There was only one. For Suleiman, this mattered. He was not a conqueror arriving at a ruin. He was a guardian arriving at a legacy. He understood that he ruled on the ruins of Rome and Byzantium, and that the continuity between them was not an accident. Each empire had learned from the one before, the Romans from the Greeks, the Byzantiums from the Romans, the Ottomans from both. Their buildings overlapped, their laws echoed one another, their dreams of permanence shared the same skyline. So when the new sultan stepped into Topkapi Palace, the courtyards glimmering with wet marble, the air heavy with cypress, he was stepping into a story already half written. The gates closed behind him, and the empire, vast and expectant, waited for his first decision. Continuity was his inheritance, and also his test, to keep the old order alive while shaping something entirely his own. The empire Suleiman inherited looked boundless from the outside, yet its strength lay in something invisible, a design of obedience and reward that reached from the smallest village to the throne itself. Every piece of land, every title, every salary began and ended with the Sultan. In Europe, nobles passed estates to their sons. In the Ottoman world, nothing belonged to anyone permanently. When a governor died, his house emptied, his horses were taken back to the treasury, and another man stepped into his place as if the previous life had been folded away. The state did not fear death. It had practiced replacing men for centuries. This arrangement made the empire less fragile than it seemed. Without hereditary lords, no province could become a private kingdom. A soldier who served well might govern a district. An official who failed could vanish overnight. Everything was written on sand that only the Sultan's signature could harden. To outsiders, it looked cruel. To those inside, it looked clean. A single source of power that could not be divided. But people are not born knowing loyalty. The Ottomans built it. From Christian villages in the Balkans and Anatolia came a levy known as Devshirme, the gathering. Every few years, officials arrived with lists and scales, measuring, questioning, choosing boys perhaps 8 or 10 years old. Families understood what it meant. Their child would leave, be converted to Islam, and never return home. Yet they also knew that in this strange system, a poor shepherd's son could rise higher than any local lord. Many sent their sons willingly. Others wept and hid them. Either way, the empire gathered its human tax and carried it to the capital. In Istanbul, the boys entered a world that remade them. They learned Turkish and Persian, the language of the court and the language of poetry. They memorized law, scripture, mathematics. They ran, drilled, and learned the stillness of discipline, how to wait without shifting, how to move only on command. From this quiet foundry came the Janissaries, the new soldiers. They were not conscripts. They were possessions of the state, forbidden to marry, to trade, to drink, or to own land. Their entire identity pointed towards service. They were the walking embodiment of control. Others among the Devshirme entered schools inside the palace. The brightest became scribes, judges, diplomats, and, in time, viziers, the high ministers who ran the empire's machinery under the Sultan's gaze. Ibrahim Pasha, who would one day stand at Suleiman's right hand, came from this world. Born a Christian boy on the Aegean coast, he grew into one of the most powerful men in Islamic history. The system that could turn a captive into a counselor had no equal in Europe. It made the empire elastic. It could take talent from anywhere and use it immediately. Social mobility in the Ottoman sense was not freedom, it was function. The janissary or the vizier did not climb to escape the state, but to sink deeper into it. Ambition fused with loyalty because both were rewarded by the same source, the Sultan himself. As long as he lived, the web held. When he died, it reshaped around the next ruler without snapping. This hierarchy was mirrored by a quiet pluralism. Within the empire's borders lived Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Serbs, Jews, Persians, languages crossing like threads on a loom. The law divided the world into two broad realms: Dar al-Islam, the House of Peace, where Muslim law ruled, and Dar al-Harb, everything beyond. Yet, within the House of Peace, the Ottomans allowed surprising variety. Communities kept their faiths and courts. A Christian bishop might judge marriage disputes in his own flock. A rabbi might settle trade questions among his people. Each group paid taxes, accepted imperial authority, and, in return, lived under its own rhythm. It was not equality, but it was coexistence, an order wide enough to fit contradiction. Suleiman did not invent this system, but he understood its precision. He knew that armies and palaces could not stand long without the thin wires of bureaucracy beneath them. The Sultan's divan, his council, met in a domed chamber, marble cold beneath their feet. Outside, petitions piled high in the hands of clerks who wrote and rewrote decrees until ink stained their fingers. The state lived in those lines: permits for ships, orders for wheat, judgments on inheritance, each carrying the same small red seal. If you walked through the first courtyard of Topkapi on a morning before the council met, you would see the janissaries lining the path. Hundreds of men in white felt hats and layered uniforms, faces expressionless, eyes forward. They did not talk, they did not shift their weight. Visitors often compared them to statues, though a faint creak of armor or the wind moving through feathers might remind you that they were human. Between them, messengers hurried with documents rolled in silk. In the distance, the gate to the second courtyard waited, the line between the ordinary world and the chambers where the empire spoke. This calm order was the Ottoman genius. It replaced birthright with discipline, accident with structure. Its dangers were real: corruption, rebellion, the slow freezing of a system that trusted no one entirely. But for now, it worked. It allowed the empire to stretch from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Hungary without breaking. It allowed Suleiman to rule men he would never meet and lands he would never see. And it gave the capital a serenity that was both beautiful and strange. A city where power moved like water through pipes, unseen, constant, and perfectly contained. The Ottoman Empire was not just large, it was workable. From the outside, it looked like a giant circle drawn across continents, touching seas and mountains that had nothing in common. But inside that circle, the machinery ran with a kind of quiet precision. It was not freedom that held it together, and not fear alone. It was habit, the deep rhythm of rules, taxes, and duties repeating year after year, until the empire itself seemed to breathe. The heart of that rhythm was Istanbul. At dawn, the city already sounded like order made audible, the call to prayer answering the clatter of hooves, the whisper of scribes opening their ledgers, the hum of water wheels feeding fountains and baths. Ships filled the Golden Horn, their hulls heavy with wheat from Egypt, furs from Crimea, and silver from the Balkans. By mid-morning, the Great Bazaar had swallowed 100 languages into one continuous murmur. Every merchant knew the same two constants: the measure of a coin and the reach of the Sultan's seal. Inside Topkapi Palace, the same pattern ruled. The council met beneath a mosaic dome, sunlight cutting through grills, painting the floor in thin squares of gold. Grand viziers debated petitions from distant provinces, a village boundary in Albania, a caravan license in Aleppo, a dispute over water rights in Anatolia. Each decision followed a ladder of authority, up through clerks, through scribes, through ministers, until it touched the only man who could make it real. No law was law until it carried the signature of the Sultan. Power began and ended in one hand. That simplicity was both genius and danger. The empire had no permanent class of rulers, no independent aristocracy to balance the throne. The janissary owed his life to the sultan. The vizier owed his fortune. Even the judges, men trained for years in the subtleties of Islamic law, ultimately served at his pleasure. When an official died, his property returned to the treasury. When a governor was dismissed, his title vanished with him. The empire itself never changed owners, it only changed caretakers. For those living within it, this meant that loyalty flowed upward, not sideways. A farmer in Macedonia might never see the capital, but the tax he paid climbed through the same channels as a general's tribute from Baghdad. Each coin, each record, each decision curved back toward Istanbul, and finally to the Sultan's will. It was a kind of gravitational pull that kept the world from flying apart. Religion gave that pull its meaning. Islamic law, Sharia, covered worship, family, inheritance, and ethics. But Suleiman also governed a diverse empire where not everyone was Muslim, and where trade, property, and military affairs required their own clarity. He refined and expanded Qanun, the imperial law, a set of civil regulations drawn not from revelation but from reason and precedent. Together, they formed two wings of the same bird, the divine and the practical. The judges interpreted the first, the Sultan enforced the second. Where they met, the empire found its balance. In practice, this meant that an Armenian merchant could appeal a debt case in his own court, while a Muslim farmer might be judged by a local qadi, and both outcomes still stood under the same imperial authority. The system was flexible enough to absorb difference without breaking, and rigid enough to remind everyone where power truly lived. Wealth flowed in along the same channels as authority. Taxes from Egypt fed the capital's kitchens. Tithes from the Balkans built mosques and bridges. The treasury recorded everything, down to the number of buttons on a janissary's coat or the weight of copper for a cannon. It was this bureaucracy, precise, tireless, endlessly rewriting its own lists, that gave the empire its shape. A shape defined not by geography, but by control. And yet, beneath the calm surface, there was fragility. All of it, the order, the wealth, the movement of ships and soldiers, depended on a single mind. The moment a sultan died, the empire held its breath. Messages raced to the provinces. Soldiers waited to see which banner to salute. Sometimes the transition passed in silence. Sometimes it tore the world open. Suleiman knew this. He ruled with care because he understood what happened when the center shifted. Every law he wrote, every appointment he signed, every coin stamped with his tugra was another thread holding the system together for one more generation. It worked beautifully, as long as he did. And so the empire stretched, glittering and immense, built on order and resting on faith, but balancing always on one man's will. By the time Suleiman sat firmly on his throne, Europe was tangled in its own rivalries. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, ruled a collection of lands so vast that people joked the sun could never set on his domains. He held Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and much of Italy. His ships crossed to the New World. His gold crossed back. But his power, like any woven fabric, was stretched thin. To his west stood Francis of France, restless, brilliant, and unwilling to kneel before another monarch. The two men were locked in a contest for Europe itself, fighting over duchies, crowns, and pride. Their wars burned through Italy, drained treasuries, and left the continent divided. It was into this distracted landscape that the Ottoman Empire advanced, steady, disciplined, and unified under one ruler. Suleiman's first major campaign carried him north toward the Danube. The fortress of Belgrade stood there, guarding the river like a stone gate. It had resisted his grandfather, but in 1521, after weeks of bombardment and fire, it fell. The road into Central Europe lay open. The army moved with precision. Tens of thousands of men, columns of horses, cannons dragged on wooden sleds across soft earth. Chroniclers wrote that it looked less like an army and more like a moving city. 5 years later came the Great Collision, the Battle of Mohács. The Hungarian kingdom had once been a buffer between the Ottomans and the heart of Europe. Now, its young king gathered what troops he could. Noble cavalry, foreign mercenaries, priests carrying crosses, and faced an army far larger and more experienced. On a wet August day in 1526, under low gray clouds, the fields near the Danube turned to mud. The Hungarians charged. The Ottomans waited. Then the guns spoke. Short, terrible bursts that shattered the line of horsemen before they could reach the front ranks. Within an hour, the battle was finished. The king drowned in retreat. The plain was silent, except for the rain and the work of soldiers burying the dead. The victory at Mohács was not just a conquest, it was a turning point. Hungary collapsed into fragments, one part absorbed by the Ottomans, another ruled by a vassal king, the rest claimed by the Habsburgs. A vacuum opened at the center of Europe, and Suleiman stepped in without haste, as if continuing a task long prepared for him. 3 years later, the empire reached Vienna. The march north was a feat in itself, over swollen rivers and ruined roads, through cold rain that turned camps into swamps. By September 1529, the Ottoman army, enormous and exhausted, stood before the city walls. Inside, the defenders, Austrians, Germans, Spaniards, watched from towers as the vast camp unfolded below them. For weeks, the siege turned into a battle of mud and time. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels beneath the bastions. The defenders dug counter-tunnels, filling them with smoke or water to force the attackers out. When the final assaults came, they were brave and hopeless at once. Rain fell heavier, gunpowder grew damp, and winter pressed close. At last, Suleiman ordered the retreat. He left behind wrecked wagons, frozen corpses, and a sense of unfinished ambition. The empire had reached the door to Europe, but the door did not open. Still, the failure was not defeat. Suleiman's army returned home intact, its discipline unbroken. And in his own eyes, he was no less than Charles or Francis, their equal in rank, superior in wealth and command. When his envoys wrote to European courts, they did not call him Sultan, but Emperor. He did not consider himself part of the European order. He considered himself its counterpart. The world, to him, held two true emperors, himself and Charles, and each believed he spoke for civilization. While Europe remained his arena of prestige, the East called him back to faith and legacy. The Safavid Shahs of Persia ruled a rival empire built on Shia Islam, different in doctrine and defiant in pride. Along the eastern frontier, desert winds carried news of skirmishes, rebellions, and shifting loyalties. Suleiman led campaigns into Mesopotamia, crossing dry plains where the horizon shimmered like metal. When his army entered Baghdad in 1534, it was not just a strategic conquest, it was symbolic. Baghdad had once been the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, the cradle of Islamic learning and authority. By reclaiming it, the Ottoman Sultan could claim continuity with the caliphs, a mantle not of conquest, but of stewardship. The empire now stretched from the Danube to the Tigris, a ribbon of authority wrapped around the Mediterranean's rim. But land was only half the story. The sea, restless and borderless, was calling. The Ottoman fleet was still young, learning its craft from shipwrights and sailors drawn from Greece, Egypt, and North Africa. Its first major test was the island of Rhodes. The Knights of St. John had held it for centuries, raiding Ottoman coasts and disrupting trade. In 1522, Suleiman laid siege to it personally. The walls were thick, the defenders skilled. For months, cannons thundered and mines collapsed beneath the earth. At last, exhausted and facing starvation, the knights surrendered. Suleiman, with a gesture typical of his style, allowed them to leave unharmed. He admired courage, even in defeat, and cruelty never impressed him as much as control. After Rhodes, the empire turned westward, into the open sea. The Mediterranean was the highway of the 16th century, a web of trade routes, a stage for ambition. Here, Suleiman found a partner in a man the Europeans called Barbarossa. He was a corsair from the islands, a pirate in name, an admiral in practice. His beard gave him the nickname, his talent made him indispensable. When Suleiman brought him to Istanbul and named him admiral of the fleet, he effectively turned piracy into policy. Barbarossa's ships swept through the Aegean and the Adriatic, seizing islands, capturing galleys, and carrying prisoners to the slave markets of the capital. To the Christian powers, the sea began to feel smaller, a blue space steadily filled with Ottoman sails. At its height, the fleet turned the eastern Mediterranean into what Venetian merchants grimly called a Turkish lake. This rise at sea brought new alliances and stranger friendships. In a move that shocked Europe, France, Catholic and ancient, reached out to the Muslim Empire for help against its Christian rival, the Habsburgs. Francis and Suleiman exchanged letters, gifts, and promises. Their armies even fought parallel campaigns, French soldiers in Italy and Ottoman ships in the Mediterranean, coordinated loosely by messengers who crossed borders disguised as traders. To their enemies, it was scandal. To both kings, it was strategy. In politics, faith bends easily to need. Through the 1540s and 1550s, Ottoman power reached its widest expression. Conflicts with Venice, with the Knights of Malta, with Spain and Genoa flickered like brush fires along the coasts, none decisive, all cumulative. The empire seemed everywhere at once, building mosques in the capital, fighting Persia in the east, and sailing past Sicily in the west. It was a moment of supreme confidence, a sense that history itself was turning in the empire's rhythm. When Suleiman looked at his dominions, he saw not chaos, but pattern. Each victory, each treaty, each fleet sailing out of the Golden Horn was another thread in a design larger than a single life. He had proven himself against emperors, bent princes to his will, and reached both ends of the known world. The armies he commanded had marched farther, faster, and with greater order than any since Rome. And yet, under all that splendor, there was the quiet hum of wear, the weight of years, of campaigns repeated, of maps that could grow no larger without stretching thin. But for now, the empire glowed like metal fresh from the forge, too bright to touch, too strong to question. Every empire has two worlds, the one it shows and the one it hides. The Ottoman court was no different. Outside the palace gates, life moved in public patterns, soldiers drilling, viziers meeting, judges writing decrees. Inside, behind walls of marble and lattice, another rhythm governed the sultan's life, the world of the harem. The word has gathered centuries of misunderstanding. In the West, it became a fantasy, a cloud of silk and perfume, a place of pleasure. In truth, it was something else, an institution, as carefully structured as the army or the treasury. The harem was both household and school. It held the women who served the palace, the wives and concubines of the sultan, their children, and the older women who managed them. It was guarded not by soldiers, but by silence, ritual, and rank. Girls entered from many paths, captured in war, purchased from distant markets, or given as tribute by governors hoping to please the throne. They learned languages, music, and etiquette. Some became attendants, some became tutors to the younger princes. Only a few ever met the sultan face to face. And among those few, one would sometimes rise, not through beauty alone, but through intelligence, calm, and timing. In Suleiman's reign, that person was a young woman from what is now Ukraine. Her name in the palace was Hurrem, the joyful one. Europe would later call her Roxolana. She arrived as a captive and, through some quiet combination of wit and presence, drew the sultan's attention. At first, she was one among many. Then, slowly, she was not. She became his companion, his advisor, his favorite, and, in time, something rarer still, his wife. For more than 2 centuries before her, Ottoman sultans had not married. They took concubines, and their sons were born to women who held influence but not formal titles. Marriage implied equality, and equality had no place beside the throne. Suleiman broke that pattern. He freed Hurrem from servitude and married her. The ceremony was private, the meaning immense. It turned a captured girl into the legal queen of the empire and shifted the balance of the court. Hurrem's letters to her husband survive. Graceful, affectionate, sometimes playful. She called him my sultan, my life, my everything. But she was more than tender words. She learned to navigate politics, to place allies in key posts, to protect her children from rivals. Envoys wrote that her smile could change the course of a meeting. Ambassadors sent her gifts as if she were another ruler. From her private apartments, she built a network of influence that reached across the empire. And Suleiman, who could be cold to generals and courtiers, seemed to trust her without reserve. Yet love in the palace was never separate from power. Every affection there carried a consequence. For years, the most powerful man in the empire, beyond the sultan himself, was Ibrahim Pasha, a childhood companion, a convert through the Devshirme, and later Suleiman's grand vizier. The two were inseparable. They dined together, hunted together, even slept under the same tent on campaigns. Suleiman called him brother. But time changes what closeness means. Ibrahim's confidence grew with his achievements. He negotiated treaties in his own name, built a palace that rivaled the sultan's, and let his tongue wander into boldness. He began to act less like a servant and more like a partner. Rumors multiplied. Whispers said he mocked the clerics, that he spoke too freely of his own power. The harem, and perhaps Hurrem herself, watched his rise with unease. One night in 1536, after a banquet at the palace, Ibrahim was summoned to a private room. He bowed, expecting another conversation with his friend. When the door closed, the silence was final. By morning, he was dead. The order had come from Suleiman. No announcement, no trial, only absence. The empire did not pause. Appointments were made, files were reassigned. But for the man who had once shared his dreams, the sultan left no trace of mourning. It was as if friendship itself had never existed. After Ibrahim's fall, the court grew quieter and more guarded. The harem's influence deepened, and Hurrem's presence filled the spaces Ibrahim had left. But power in the Ottoman world never stayed still. It flowed like water, finding new tensions to cut through. Among those tensions was succession. Suleiman had several sons, some by Hurrem, one by another woman, Mahidevran. The eldest, Mustafa, was admired by the army and beloved by the people. He was strong, handsome, disciplined, the ideal prince. For years, he seemed destined to inherit the empire. But the empire was also a family, and families carried jealousy in their bones. Letters began to circulate, anonymous, cautious, claiming that Mustafa plotted against his father, that he planned to seize the throne with Janissary support. Some said the rumors were true. Others said they were planted by Hurrem and her allies to secure the future for her own sons. We cannot know. What we do know is how it ended. In 1553, during a campaign against Persia, Suleiman ordered his son to appear before him in the royal tent. Mustafa entered wearing the plain robe of a supplicant. He bowed once. Behind him, the guards stepped forward, men who had been trained to move without hesitation, without sound. When they struck, it was sudden, practiced, final. Mustafa fought back, strong enough to break free for a moment, until his father, hidden behind a curtain, gave a single gesture. The tent fell silent again. Outside, the soldiers weighed. When they learned their prince was dead, the camp filled with grief and disbelief. Some refused to eat, others whispered of rebellion, but none came. The Sultan's authority held, outwardly unshaken, inwardly marked forever. From that day, something in Suleiman's reign turned inward. He still ruled, still commanded, still built and legislated, but the circle of trust around him had narrowed to almost nothing. Hurrem remained his confidant until her own death a few years later, and the palace grew dimmer without her. The story of these years is not simply about betrayal or love. It is about the weight of power on the human heart. Suleiman could govern a continent, could balance armies and economies, could write laws that shaped the lives of millions. But within his own house, among the people he loved most, he was as uncertain and fragile as any man. He had built an empire of order, yet his family lived in fear and rivalry. He could command silence from an army, but not peace from his own blood. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of empire, that the larger it grows, the smaller its master becomes inside it. The last years of Suleiman's life unfolded in quiet decline, like the dimming of a great lamp that had burned too long. He had ruled for more than 4 decades, long enough to outlive the energy of his youth, the advisors who built his early glory, and the woman who had shared his solitude. When Hurrem Sultan died in 1558, the palace seemed to lose a sound, a voice that had once guided and softened him. Her apartments fell silent, the courtyards around them emptied. Suleiman visited her tomb often, walking slowly through the gardens of the mosque he had built for her. The same man who once dictated letters to kings now lingered in front of stone, lips moving in prayer. Age had made him cautious, and illness made him thoughtful. He still presided over the council, still signed decrees, but his gaze had turned inward, toward faith, repentance, and the measure of his own soul. Even as he withdrew, the world around him continued its restless pattern. His surviving sons, Bayezid and Selim, grew into rivals. Bayezid was fiery and popular, bold in a way that reminded some of the lost Mustafa. Selim was quieter, less loved, but steady, and favored by those who managed the court. The brothers distrusted one another, and that distrust spread through their followers like heat through iron. What began as a contest of words and appointments became rebellion. Bayezid raised troops in Anatolia, claiming the right to the throne. Suleiman, weary and grieving, still knew what loyalty demanded. He ordered Selim to lead the campaign against his own brother. The armies met, and Bayezid's forces broke. He fled east with his sons, seeking refuge with the Shah of Persia, the same enemy his father had fought for decades. At first, the Shah received him with ceremony, perhaps hoping to use him as leverage against the Ottomans. But politics hardens where compassion fades. When Suleiman offered gold and peace in exchange for Bayezid's death, the bargain was accepted. The Shah's guards carried it out, quietly, efficiently. Father and son never saw each other again. News of the execution reached Istanbul wrapped in official phrases, but its meaning was simple. The empire was safe, and something inside the Sultan had died with his child. In his final years, Suleiman's rule became almost monastic. He spent long hours in study and prayer, writing poetry under a pen name that few recognized as his. He still planned campaigns, though he no longer rode at their head. When courtiers spoke to him, they found a man both weary and clear, like a stone polished smooth by time. In 1566, at the age of 72, he insisted on leading one more expedition, a campaign into Hungary against a small fortress called Sigitvar. It was a distant echo of his first wars, a return to the land where his empire's glory had begun. By then, he could barely mount a horse. Servants helped him into the saddle. Soldiers saw him only through curtains as his litter passed. Still, his presence steadied the army. Even old and ill, he was the symbol of the empire's endurance, the living thread that tied their victories together. As the siege dragged on, the defenders, a few thousand men under a stubborn Croatian count, refused to surrender. They fought until their walls were ash and their powder stores nearly gone. In the Ottoman camp, the Sultan's tent stood at the center, marked by banners, guarded by silence. One night, while the battle still raged, Suleiman's body finally gave way. He died quietly, surrounded by his attendants, before hearing that the fortress had fallen. For 48 years he had ruled the empire. Now it stood leaderless, and the army couldn't be told. Panic might have undone everything. So his Grand Vizier, Sakalu Mehmed Pasha, calm, capable, loyal, ordered the news sealed. He summoned the scribe who could imitate the Sultan's handwriting and continued to issue commands in his name. For weeks, the empire lived in careful fiction. Tents moved, dispatches went out, battles concluded, all signed with a dead man's pen. Only when Selim, the surviving son, arrived from Istanbul did the secret break. The old sultan's body was prepared, the banners lowered, and the empire exhaled. Suleiman died as he had lived, in command, even over silence. And though his armies had won their final battle, his true victory was stranger. He had held an empire together for half a century, long enough for its future to depend not on conquest, but on endurance. When Suleiman's body was carried back to Istanbul, the empire he left behind was immense, not only in size, but in shape and spirit. It stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of Persia to the coasts of North Africa. But its true borders were not drawn by soldiers. They were drawn by laws, by habits, and by the architecture of order that he had spent a lifetime refining. In the years that followed his death, the system he shaped continued almost by memory. The laws he codified, Kanun, became the spine of Ottoman administration for generations. They reached into every part of life: taxes, property, markets, courts, the rights of merchants and peasants alike. He had written these laws not as monuments, but as tools, things meant to be used, adjusted, lived with. It was this practicality that made them last. The city he left glowed with his mark. Istanbul was no longer a conquest, it was a masterpiece. Its skyline had changed under his patronage, rising into harmony through the genius of one man, Mimar Sinan, the Sultan's chief architect. Sinan's works carried the empire's confidence in stone, graceful domes that seemed to float, slender minarets that reached upward like calm prayers. His crowning creation, the Suleymaniye Mosque, stood on the hill above the Golden Horn. Balanced, symmetrical, vast yet tranquil. It was both a house of worship and a reflection of its patron, disciplined, deliberate, serene. Around it spread libraries, schools, kitchens for the poor, baths, fountains, gardens. It was less a building than a statement that greatness could be quiet. Under Suleiman, wealth had flowed like a steady tide. Trade moved freely between continents. Scholars and craftsmen worked under royal protection, and the empire's bureaucracy kept its rhythm with almost mechanical precision. Visitors from Europe described Istanbul as a place of unbroken order, a city where even the noise of markets sounded measured. That discipline, born of the same system that began with the Devshirme and reached to the palace, had become the empire's identity. It was what made the Ottomans feared and respected. But the balance he created was fragile. An empire built on the will of one man must learn to live without him. After his death, the machinery kept turning, but the sense of purpose began to fade. The laws endured, the faith endured, the forms endured. Yet the spirit of careful attention that once animated them slowly thinned. It was not collapse, not yet, but a long unwinding. In the centuries that followed, people gave him many names. In Europe, he remained Suleiman the Magnificent, the image of splendor, of jeweled robes and unstoppable armies. In the Islamic world, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver, the ruler who gave form to justice and order. Both names are true, and both incomplete. He was magnificent because he understood order. He was a lawgiver because he understood power. He could be merciful, and he could be absolute, a great ruler, and at moments, a tyrant. The line between them is always thinner than history pretends. Today, his tomb still stands beside Roxolana's, on the hill overlooking the Bosporus. Their domes rise side by side, framed by cypress trees and soft wind. At night, when the city quiets and the ferries slide across the water, the lights of their resting place reflect faintly on the sea, two pale circles in the darkness. Around them, the same city breathes. Different faiths, different faces, the same enduring rhythm. 5 centuries have passed, and yet the empire he imagined still hums beneath the stones, in the mosques, the laws, the silence after prayer. Suleiman once ruled from these courtyards with armies waiting at his word. Now, time rules here, slower, gentler, unanswerable. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of an empire, that even the greatest power eventually becomes a kind of stillness, and what remains are only the echoes, the laws, the stones, and the quiet memory of a man who held the world together for a while. If you've stayed until now, thank you. You've walked through an empire of marble and silence, through victories and sorrows that once shaped the map of half the world. And maybe what remains most clearly is not the noise of battles, but the quiet after them, the stillness that every ruler eventually meets. Suleiman's story reminds us that power is never a single thing. It can build mosques and laws. It can also break families and hearts. Even a man who ruled from Budapest to Baghdad could not command peace within his own walls. Perhaps that is why his monuments feel so calm, not to boast of greatness, but to rest from it. So, as the city sleeps around the Bosporus, his tomb and Roxolanas watch over it, their domes reflecting the first hints of dawn. The fairies drift below, the call to prayer begins, and time continues the work he could not finish, holding the world together for one more day. If this story brought you a little quiet, leave a thought in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you now. If you'd like more nights like this, more calm history told slowly, you can subscribe or simply stay a while. Thank you for listening. Sleep well and good night.